guys, and welcome back to the Parenting Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about parenting and roles and discipline and positive discipline in parenting as well. To do that, I would love to introduce my guest, Dr. Janice Johnson Diaz. He had joined me today. How are you going today?
I am well. How are you? Well, good morning to you, as it is good
Good
evening
morning.
to me.
Yes, yes. Time zones are definitely playing a big role here today. Yeah, so would you like to sort of introduce yourself to the audience and talk a little bit about what you do specifically?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I have many hats. I am Jamaican, so there are lots of jokes about Jamaicans having 10 jobs. My primary job up until 2 years ago, but it is still my job, is as an associate professor of sociology and criminal justice at the City University of New York, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And I am also the author of the book Parent Like It Matters: How to Raise Joyful Change Making Girls. And finally, probably a big hat that encompasses both is that I'm the president and founder of the Grassroots Community Foundation, which is a public health and social justice organization that trains and develops girls to become change makers.
Wow, and what got you into talking about this, into being something that um, into wearing so many hats, as you say?
Well, many things got me here, but I would say that the foundations of who I am and the work that I do, whether it is as a formal professor or a writer or philanthropist, really comes from the kind of early training and love and support of my community. I am from a really rural community, Retreat St. Mary, outside of Kingston, Jamaica, really on a parish that not many people know about in proper, unless you know reggae. You might know the artist Capleton, of just 433 people. And I grew up in a community that really valued supporting each other, and I emigrated to the United States in 1984 to a different kind of social condition. But I had the luxury of being surrounded by really wonderful educators and being influenced by them. And that has been a continuous thread in my life as a person who has left a really poor country to come to a wealthy country, but one that was marred with inequality. I try to take the lessons of community that I grew up with and to bring it to this kind of larger social space. Having been trained in sociology, I've learned a lot about the way in which we can be levers for action. And I try to make all of those things real in my life.
Wow, that sounds like a really big journey to get you to where you are, and it sounds very inspiring as well, actually.
That's still a bit big. I think I turned 50 this year, and a part of turning 50 is a lot of reflecting about how you got to the places that you got to. They
Yeah.
didn't feel big um, along the way. Along the way, I felt like I was just doing a thing that my heart desired, and I did another thing that my heart desired. And then when I looked up, I was 50 and had been doing a bunch of things. Um, all in the name of women, girls, and justice. Um, and so it sounds like my life was much more organized than it really was. It was really just having an open spirit and really feeling that I needed to be trained, that I needed to do my part wherever I can and however I can. And so the story sounds better than probably the journey itself.
You do not look 50, I can tell you that right now, trust me, you do not look 50.
Thank you.
So, talking a bit more about you, we're gonna play a little icebreaker, to start off the recording, and just
I
sort of
love
getting to know you instead of outside the topic as well. So the first when I say this sort of topics, just sort of come up with the first thing that sort of comes to your head.
Okay.
It's a tricky game, but because so many things can pop up at the same time. but okay,
Yes,
I'll
we'll
start.
try to keep it non-profane. I will do my best.
Okay, cool. All right, so number 1 is book.
Shelf.
Okay. Um, how about movie?
Maverick. I just came from seeing Top Gun.
Oh, yeah. I love that. How about podcast?
Oh, hard. I think a podcast is very hard, in so many ways. I think it's hard. The idea of just talking, and I don't know how podcasters do it. It feels exciting. It feels like the ante on radio is up a little bit more. So hard.
Okay. How about a role model?
No one. I struggle with the concept of role models a lot. I struggle with it for myself. My daughter gives this beautiful answer to role modeling, which I agree with, but still off, which is she tries to take qualities from different people in order to do that. But I think that I struggle with it because um, what happens is that there is a tendency to elevate people in a way that makes them superhuman. And much of my work, and even the conversation we'll have today, is to keep people from either being superhuman or inhumane, because both takes away from their humanity. And I think sometimes role modeling can do a similar thing. And so I struggle with it.
Wow, that's a really good answer, actually. How about the last one is course.
Correct. I often feel like what happens when you're on a particular course is course correction is difficult. Um, and people tend to stay on a course longer, not just simply because they don't know how to pivot, but it's the idea that you should see a thing through, that you shouldn't be a quitter. Um, and that too, I probably struggle a lot with because I have made and remade myself so many times, and that has not always been met with grace. But I think about course correction and what it means, especially as a caregiver, as a person who's had to coach young people, was just to let them know that it's okay. It's okay to pivot. That's one way. It's okay to also get off the road you're on, um, and it's okay to feel lost, even if you're staying on a particular course.
Wow, that's I'm speechless. That's such an incredible answer as well. Sorry. um, I love every single one of your answers so far. Honestly, that's it's too good. Okay, so we're gonna start talking about the topic that we've brought you on here to talk about today. Um, so for the first question, what do you think parenting is? Because there's so many definitions. What's your definition?
I felt like this was the absolute hardest thing. It's probably why I think podcasts are hard.
Mhm.
I realized I wrote a whole book on parenting, and I don't think I specifically didn't exactly define what is parenting in the book, even though I use kind of the way in which I went to Latin Academy in Boston, the way that the kind of epistemological beginnings of the word parenting, which means to bring forth. And I think about parenting as bringing forth with care. That parenting is a thing that people who are not necessarily bio folks who gave birth to or adopted children can do. Is that parenting is a process of bringing forth with care the best in children, and helping them bring the best of themselves forward. I probably more align parenting with coaching than I think most people would exactly enjoy, because I think coaches are really very good at bringing forth with care the best inside of us. But I think of parenting in that similar vein.
So it's not more so like disciplining, it's more in a way of mentoring.
It is in a way of both mentoring and coaching and
Mhm,
helping to excavate what is inside of us that may not be known to us,
mhm,
but doing it with the practice of care. Um, and I and I recognize parenting to be a really long-term endeavor.
mhm,
And I don't think I really knew that when I started. I think I could say it, but I don't think I really could say the meaning of it. That parenting is both it's a journey for the parent as well as the people who are being cared for. In my foundation, we actually rarely use the word parenting, and we often use the word caregivers,
mhm,
because of the real heavy emphasis on whatever it is that we're trying to do, that care is understood in it. But I do think of it as bringing forth with care. But I do think of it as also laborious. It is definitely
mhm.
work.
Yeah.
It's all kinds of levels of work. It's emotional work. It's physically taxing. It's clearly financially taxing, but it is a labor, while you try to bring forth the best of yourself and of young
Mhm.
people with care.
Okay. So, what do you think expectant parents need to be aware of in the transition to parenting?
Oh, from being a human, a
Yes, from being an
happy
individual to doing
non-parenting human, to an
yes.
individual, to being a parent.
Yes.
You know, I think the preparation is, if I could speak to like the universal preparation, is that I would probably say something that sounds cliche-ish, which is know yourself, um, your your clearest heart, your deepest intention, your challenges, is that so much of the way we think about parenting is about what we do with and for children rather than what we need to do with and for ourselves.
Mhm,
And I know that expectant parents are going to prepare rooms and bank accounts and housing and a whole host of external things. But really, the biggest work is preparing yourself, to be vulnerable, to be in tune with yourself, um, and to be emotionally resilient such that you can prepare yourself for this journey. The other thing that I hope expectant parents will do is to assess their ability to learn, because parenting is also a learning endeavor. It's learning about this person, or persons, and it's learning a lot about yourself.
mhm. So, with that, how would you um, get a person to be aware? What are some qualities that they would need to possess or like recommended to possess before?
Yeah. So, in my book, I have one really big activity that I ask caregivers to do, which is to take this survey called the ACEs survey, the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey. I think it's really important that caregivers to be are aware of their own traumas, and how that might trip them up, as they begin to care for
Mhm,
others. That preparation is useful, and it doesn't mean that once you know the number of ACEs that you have, because as we know, adverse childhood experiences impact the way we give care to children, and to others, but it is really important, I think, that caregivers be aware of where they stand in relationship to their own traumatic and childhood experiences. Um, I think wherever caregivers are, I encourage this, and I'll probably repeat this point several different ways, is that caregivers recognize that the social environment that they are raising their children, especially from 0 to 5, that it's an environment they're willing to make an investment in. Is that children are not just raised in houses, they are raised in communities. And if caregivers want healthy children, they're going to have to make some investment beyond the four corners of their own home. So, those are the two kind of big categories I would say that caregivers, expecting caregivers, should be prepared to do, and they should assess where they are on those things.
So it's mainly not about just about how you raise your kids, it's more about the people that you have around them as well.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah.
environment. Yeah, because, parenting, and caregiving, we want it to feel like we have some
Mhm.
control and that it's us. That, I'm so-called mother, I'm so-called father, and, what I do and say is going to have the singular biggest impact on your child. But it turns out children are social beings, and they have to leave your home, and they will go to playgrounds, they go to bookstores, they'll go to schools, they'll go to supermarkets, and you want those environments to be safe, and you want them to reflect, um, opportunities for your children's best self to come forward. And so you have to be socially connected and invested in those spaces in order for you to get the return on investment that you want, which is a healthy child. So, the notion of parenting as a solo endeavor, that is done by one or two persons, I would say disavow yourself of that, as an expectant parent, and recognize that you are entering the most socially connected process ever. And you are going to find yourself in relationship with more people than you could ever
Mhm.
imagine, simply by virtue of the fact that your child is a living social being.
Okay. Well, definitely something to be aware of. I definitely think the environment is a big space. Growing up, I moved around quite a bit, following my dad's work, following his job, and I never stuck in one space long enough to build that kind of community in itself until now, until I'm an adult and I'm starting to build that from scratch. And it does definitely does have a huge influence on you. And I think recognizing it, the positives and negatives of the community that I'm in, definitely gets me aware of it as it is, because not every community is gonna have a positive. There's always gonna be that negative there
No,
as well. So, yeah.
there's a lot of negative. I think that for me, I um, I live in a town that has a tremendous amount of negative. There are lots of positives, but it has a lot of negatives. And, sometimes my friends are in awe that I've chosen to do social justice work in my actual neighborhood because of those negatives. But it's precisely because I have a child
Mhm.
here. It is precisely that if I want to have a healthy child, despite the hardships, is that I have to do and create spaces just like I would take things out of her reach that could harm her when she was young. I would secure that is a necessary condition too. And as a person who moved around, probably not as much as you did, is that I saw how important environments are, because you could be in an environment for a year or two, and you would think that your family's house would be the safest, but that year or two can be so impactful in terms of how you see people, what you have access to, whether or not you're put in a situation of danger. Um, and I think caregivers so often think that their home is the singular central place for, caregiving activity, and it is just one of the places. And, those other spaces, again, schools, playgrounds, supermarkets, etc., bookstores, they shape a lot of the way we see the world. And our children take in a lot very, very early. So we ought to be mindful. And caregivers, I hope expectant parents will recognize that their home really matters. What occurs in their home, having amicable relationships within the walls of their home are really essential for children's health and well being, but also being in social spaces that are equally amicable are going to affect your child and your children as well.
Mhm. Holding that discipline, how would you define positive discipline?
Well, so I, when I saw this
Mhm.
term, I went and I read up like every good sociologist would do, and Jane Nielsen's kind of five anchors of positive discipline. I have to say that I think about discipline in a very I don't know, in a very specific way. Again, because I'm a sociologist, I think a lot about how these things interact with the social environment. And I think about discipline as really a code of behavior that is infused with morals and values. And that children are taught how to understand and make sense of this code or these codes, and then how to adhere to them, um, especially in ways that enhances their well-being. So I don't write. It's so funny because what the reason I said yes to being on this podcast is because so many people ask me about discipline. They're like, you don't mention discipline at all in your book. There has to be something that you have to say about discipline, and I have a lot to say about
Mhm.
discipline. Um, and I think the concept of positive discipline makes sense to me. But I don't think of parenting as an enterprise where discipline is the biggest
Mhm.
deal. Um, I've not had to punish my child a lot. I've not had to punish children under my care a lot. But I've had to explain to children why certain codes of behavior are really important to adhere to. And I've had to help them really understand as they behave in ways that are not in alignment with that code. Um, and I feel like we co-create. There are certainly certain codes of behavior and morals that I really held that just didn't hold for my child and for the children. But I do think that this act of mutual respect, this act of kindness, this act of social integration, that these things are really important for children. That children shouldn't be disciplined in a vacuum.
Mhm.
And they certainly should not be told because I told you so as the singular response.
Mhm.
And my favorite part of the way Nielsen describes positive parenting is thinking about discipline and its long arc. What do we want the long term consequences or benefits of discipline to have rather than just singularly thinking about the short term course of action?
Okay. So it's in a sense of still coaching them between right and wrong rather than actually saying, "Okay, you're doing this wrong, and I'm telling you you're doing this wrong." Mhm.
Yes. So my mother used to do, I would say that I don't think she would have considered herself having being a positive person who uses positive discipline. But what she used to say is in Jamaican patois, she was like, whenever I would do something that was simply out of order, she would say, "Do you know the difference between right and wrong?
Mhm.
Why you choose wrong?" And sometimes I didn't
Mhm.
know because what she had defined as wrong made perfect sense to me,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? And that question, even though sometimes I felt like it was rhetorical, was super helpful to me because she was like, "Did you know you weren't supposed to do that?" Sometimes we think children know because again, we can't prescribe every situation that a child gets into, and we assume that they did a thing that they were clear on. So she would always kind of ask me, "Did you know?" And sometimes I didn't know. I didn't know it was that big a deal. I didn't know it mattered that much. I didn't know that the consequences could be that grave. right? And oftentimes it was around the consequences. So, like, this is pre cell phone. So my mother would say, after 5 o'clock, at the end of our street, we were in a neighborhood where we were only two black families in a white neighborhood when we moved to Boston. So we're leaving an all black country. And she said, after 5 o'clock, when the dust came down, I should take a cab, right? About a three-fourths of a mile. I should take a cab home. And she said, call me on the phone first and then take the cab. And so sometimes I just wanted to keep the money. So I just walk instead. Sometimes I would forget to call. And she would just get very upset. And I made it home safely. So I didn't understand the reason why. Yes, she gave me these rules, but they felt like they were arbitrary in many respects. Why must I call you? I'm 16. I can make it to the house on time. But she worked all the time, so knowing where I was going to be meant that if something went awry, she had a timestamp of when I arrived. And that was a security measure for her because of her own anxieties about violence and little girls going missing. I didn't know any of those things. She only told me to do a thing. So when she asked me why I didn't do it, I was like, it's not a big deal. But when she contextualized it, then I was able to make sense of her
Mhm.
worry,
Yeah.
right? And even if I were going to break it, I had more information than I did previously. So, this I think is an important feature of positive discipline that matters and that I really like about the way it has been described, which is giving kids more information so that they can understand the point of view of those who care for them.
Yeah. I always think that as well, like growing up, probably similar, not to that extent, but just, "Oh, I forgot to call," or I just didn't I was too busy, I forgot to let you know that I got there, and until now, I only found out that it's because she just wants to know, like, what you are like, timestamp exactly know where you are because of situations that can happen, but growing up, you didn't think of it.
It seems like nothing. I was like, why is she so
Yeah.
mad?
It's like,
Like,
if I had known why you were worried, then I probably would've, like I would've let you know a little bit more. Um,
yeah, I'm still probably not gonna let you know to the I mean, that's the thing.
yeah.
It's just there may be better behavior. It may still be deeply imperfect, but I think that that kind of
Mhm.
exchange is really, really
Yeah.
helpful for children. Um, but I think too many adults miss that step
Yep.
altogether because they're like, "I told you so, and this is
Yeah.
sufficient." And it's like, no, mutual respect is an important part, and information and context is an important
Yeah,
part.
for sure. I think it's definitely important when if the child knows, "Okay, this is exactly why I am worried. You need to be careful of this." I think a lot of parents, are worried of, like, scaring their child, but in a way, it's sort of not letting them
Yes,
know scares
and
them
I
even
think that
more.
they should. Yeah, a lot of caregivers don't want to tell children hard realities, and there are age appropriate ways to tell hard
Mhm.
realities, right? Um, at 16, you can tell me that girls get abducted, and that there are a lot of girls missing in the nation. But probably at 7, probably too
Yeah,
hard, right?
exactly.
But you can find ways of telling me at 7 that you worry, that you worry.
Yeah,
You worry. You can say you worry. And children are like, well, I don't want you to worry. Children don't want, if you're raising a child that has a good attachment, that you have laid out some foundations for them, they don't want their caregivers to worry. They want to be cared for and they want to care as well.
yeah. No, 100%.
But at 16, definitely tell me.
Yeah.
Definitely tell me.
Like, know the whole picture about what's going on.
Yes.
Um, so
Yes.
what would you say are the roles in positive discipline in caregiving?
Well, I think that there are a couple of roles. I think that the rules of the game are set by the caregivers, um, and that needs to be clear to children. And I think people worry about that power position. Children and adults do not have equal power. And an attempt to suggest that they do, I think, um, always runs into problems for both children and adults. The power differential is just, it's great. As an adult, you have the governing power, you have the veto, um, you have the power of the pen and the dollar. And children need to understand that with great clarity. That does not negate respect. Respect can still occur even in a power differential. So I think that children should be aware of their standing, but they should also be made aware about how respect works. And respect is given, and all of life deserves respect. You don't have to work for respect. Respect is a given thing, and children should be aware of that. I think that those two roles are really clear. I think being informed about um, what is happening in the world is the responsibility of the caregiver. And this, to me, caregivers who decide that they're going to be non learners put children at risk and, in fact, raise children who are not likely to be empathetic or good citizens of the world. And so caregivers need to be informed about a set of things. That doesn't mean that caregivers need to be doctors, right? They don't need to know everything about a staph infection or about the flu or etc. or every detail, but learners in terms of being willing to find information that can help children understand their social world. I also think that one of the crucial role of children is to be learners themselves, is to discover information that they too can share. Because children have a bird's eye view into this youthful world that caregivers need to be curious about. Children are going into schools, they are going into places that caregivers might have gone to that school, might have been in that community, but they weren't there in this
Mhm.
time, in this moment. So children are seeing things with a different eye, and that eye needs to be respected and it needs to be given opportunities to share. And caregivers need to see themselves as being curious learners about children's world. Similarly, caregivers should really be clear as to what they share in terms of their anxieties with children. And I say that really in reference to the last moment, but into other things. So, financial insecurities, emotional insecurities. I think it's fair to share with children in age appropriate ways, but not in a way that makes children feel insecure, that they feel like their home is going to disappear, their caregivers are going to disappear, and that they don't have stability. And so, a part of the caregiver's role is to create a context of security at all levels so that children can be joyful and that they can live in a way that is much more peaceful
Mhm.
and childlike.
So, so definitely the role of the caregiver is to enforce some sort of a sense of understanding of the world to the child without the child
Yes.
discovering it on their own. And is it a lot more negative if they discover it on their own without the caregiver's advice or understanding?
Yeah, and I would like to amend. It's not that they won't discover it on their own, is that their discovery should be respected. I do think that there are things that caregivers need to have to help children be aware as they go into the world. So, like caregivers here in the United States, they should inform children that there are inequalities in the world.
Mhm.
That shouldn't surprise children in the United States. Um, but it ends up being a surprise to children, you know, up until they get to college. They're like, are you really telling me that the United States is predominantly
Mhm.
white? Like that one, that should not, children should not have to
Mhm.
wait until they are 17, 18 to recognize that the United States is 70 plus percent white,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? Are there poor people in the world, right? Like they're not just on television. That these are some of the things that children need to know, and they should have a sense of why. There is a reason why the United States, for example, is predominantly white, just like there is a reason why Jamaica is predominantly black,
Yeah.
right? These are kind of things that, and you should say them, but you should also help children read and learn about them so that they have that understanding rather than walk into situations where that is solely avoidable. In the United States, right, there's a dominant religion that people practice. Other religions are also practiced, but this is what is done. So these kinds of anchors, because we do prepare children, especially for school. We're saying you're going to have a teacher. This is going to be your teacher. If you have a question, you go to your teacher. If the teacher can't answer, you'll go to your guidance counselor. You go to your principal. We tell children a set of things, but around social realities, we pretend that um, they are non-existent or that they will discover them
Mhm.
somehow. And we somehow have decided, and this is both for the place that I'm from and the United States, is that the childhood should be filled with ignorance,
Mhm.
um, and a kind of ignorance that at one moment, as soon as you become an adult, there'll be this grand knowing.
Mhm.
um, and I'm not sure how we got to that place that adulthood and grand knowing will occur, because sometimes people just get older and they stay as ignorant as they once
Yeah.
were. But we've made up this narrative, and I think it harms all of us. So my hope is that adults will tell children some basic social facts, and they will encourage a discovery because those social facts will change over
Yeah.
time. Um, because what was once true when I was young is no longer true.
Exactly. No. Yeah.
And that's okay.
No, I definitely grew up like, I grew up in a going to Islamic schools. So, and a lot of my friends that I knew there was one I remember specifically, there was one field trip that we went to, and it was going to the city, like a museum in the city. Um, and she was amazed. She was like, "There's actually a river in the city?" Like, she's never even been
This is
into the
what
city itself. And my mom was there with me, and she and I just looked at each other like, 'cause she's never been outside of her community because her mom doesn't let her go. So, there's that.
yeah. And the thing is, there's that. So a part of the reason why I really enjoy my daughter's work is that books give us opportunities to know even if we haven't
Mhm,
experienced it, right? So the first time I was on a plane was when I was 12 years old, but we knew planes existed, right? So not having experienced it yourself is not enough. And I think that that's the piece of a curious mind that caregivers really have to have for themselves, and they have to have for their
mhm,
children. And they need to have that even around discipline, right? Which is like, where's the curiosity in trying to understand the unknown? Because we cannot expect to know every detail, right? We should know some fundamental details, but if we have a curiosity about knowing, then that's just really inviting. And that creates opportunities of understanding, which would allow for greater levels of
mhm,
empathy and further justice in the world. But that curiosity is missing,
mhm,
right? Um, because dogma, do as I say, is so prevalent across the
mhm.
world. Um, and so I do wish, and I see parent as an opportunity to build curious people, and to bring that curiosity forward.
How do you think the whole "do as I say" sort of, parenting method, how do you think that sort of impacted, would that have actually have an impact on today's children?
I think so. I think that, again, the power is really great. Adults have tremendous power. Parenting has such power. I think the short term effects of just do it. If I say to do this game, do this thing, I think that the short term effects are likely to work. Um, and um, I just think that they're not likely to build healthy humans.
Hmm.
They're going to be a series of enforcements, punitive enforcements that you will keep doing, and you'll have to up the ante, right? Because as children become curious or try new things, they will do something that's considered egregious, and then you will have to hammer them down even more and more. So then the enterprise of parenting becomes that of a warden,
Hmm.
and it will
Yeah,
hold for as long as the child is there. But that's super tedious. The reason why we want healthy children is that it makes parenting super easy, right?
yeah,
Like a
yeah.
healthy child who understands the code of behavior will do the right thing, and then you're in a relationship with the child on such a different level. And this is for me a part of the reason why I'm even, I can talk about parenting with such glee, is because when you have a well disciplined child, it's the easiest thing on the planet.
Yep.
Um, and then you're just like, oh, 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 right?
It's like I can be friends with my
Um,
child. It's easier to be
I can
friends
be
with
friendly.
them. Yeah.
It is much easier to be friendly than a warden. I absolutely hate
Mhm.
the task of having to, you know,
Yeah.
lay down martial law. It just makes you tired.
So how do you think, positive discipline impacts a child's further impacts a child's cognitive development?
Yeah, so I thought a little bit about this. So as a sociologist, I try not to talk about people's brains too much,
Mhm.
because sociologists, we like to look at what is happening outside. But there are a few things that sociologists and psychologists, places that we meet, and that's probably around the fight or flight. Um, and what happens in the frontal lobe of people's minds, is that it is really important that people feel this sense of belonging and this sense of attachment. The psychologists who've done such great work on how early attachment shapes people's sense of community engagement, and for sociologists, social cohesion, that really matters. But for me, I would say that the more that we engage in the kind of parenting that fosters empathy, mutual respect, and is connected, what we call are calling positive discipline, is the more likely we are to get young people who are not consistently in a fight or flight mode, who really feel like they can engage with others and connect with others. And that is going to improve their cognition, and therefore improve their ability to learn and understand. And we need that in order to have active, agentic humans and participants in the world.
Mhm. And as we talk about positive discipline and how it affects, how do you think it will affect their behavior a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that what happens is that if children are appropriately held to standards of and codes of good behavior, um, that considers others and considers themselves, considered others' health and well-being and their own health and well-being, and takes stock of the fact that they are a part of a community, then we're likely to see likely to see few fights, right? Like we're not going to see as much classroom disruption, which I know teachers across the board are concerned with, especially those before third grade. We're also likely to see fewer rates of the things that we see in adult behavior, which is, homicides and other kind of behaviors that harm. But for me, probably one of the things that we are less likely to see is self harm. um, is that people who feel like they belong, people who feel socially connected, people who feel like they're aligned with passion and purpose because they have a sense of things inside of them that really came from their early socialization, are less likely to probably use drugs, to engage in risky sex behavior, to harm or engage in suicidal ideation or suicidal attempts or even completion of suicide. So I do think that this idea of um, how people are taught to respond to when they have not adhere to a set of rules are going to have a set of long-term consequences, both about how their mind develops, but also how they behave in relationship to themselves and to the world.
Mhm. And how would that, like, as it impacts their behavior, does it also have a huge impact on, um, like, generation trauma and dealing with relationships in the future? So does it sort of like catch on further in?
I think it's likely to, like I said before, I think when I ask folks to take the adverse childhood experience evaluation, is that we know that the traumatic things that happen to us. So let's say you don't use positive discipline and you use more punitive ways of getting your children to adhere to the codes of behaviors that you want. Is that if those practices that you employ are harsh, are devoid of respect, make children feel displaced, and physically harms them with great recurrences, then it would stand to reason that those practices would stay with them. And so as they become caregivers, and especially if they manage to be economically successful, which is what, at least in this culture, ends up being a greater measure of success, which is like, oh, my caregivers beat me and treated me poorly, but look at me now, I'm a CEO. Then you might think that this practice works if the goal of parenting is to have economically successful children. But I would say that the goal of parenting is not about economic success singularly. It is about raising really healthy humans, and certainly having children who are able to provide for themselves financially, such that they um, are not on the streets, is an important part of a healthy person, but it's not the singularly most important part of health and well-being. Economic success is one measure
Mhm.
of wellness, and I do think that people will employ punitive discipline if that has been the way that they were disciplined when they were
Mhm.
young. So they have to unlearn that.
That's a really good point. It's really interesting because even, like, you watch on YouTube and people who have become YouTubers and things like that, and, like, I was watching one very recently, she was kicked out of her house at 16, and she sort of built her life up, and now she's living in New York City in an apartment in a penthouse in New York City, and it's like, did you get there because that happened to you or because you wanted to in spite of what happened to you? So
Yeah, and it may be. And the thing is, by the time she's 50 and talking to you, she could tell a story that suggests that she's okay. See,
Mhm,
this I think those are the things that worry me, right? When economic success is such the big driver for um, what the goal of life is like, I have been beaten, I got thrown out, I was treated like crap, but now look at me. I am, I have a million or two followers. I'm doing great. And then all of a sudden, we might look up and you will see that somebody has prematurely ended their lives. And we're like, but they were so successful. And we're like, if that is the way we keep thinking about success, then we
mhm,
will fail to understand what wellness is. Because it's clear. We've now had the series over the past 3 years of really financially successful people who are suffering at such deep levels. So, what I hope is that if that YouTuber ever becomes an expectant parent, maybe before, is that that YouTuber engages in the work of healing so that they can employ new ways of caring for the new lives that they will bring forth. Because this obsession with financial success is a great, great risk um, to the health and well being of children and to the society as a whole.
Mhm. No, I think that's a really good aspect to look into, not just the economic side to it, but like also the mental space that this person has in their head. Yeah. So, what do you think are the most common obstacles that parents will face when implementing positive discipline?
Um, the child. Right? The first obstacle is, let's say you're a caregiver who's come from punitive discipline, right? If you've
Hmm.
come from punitive discipline, there's sometimes a reflex. Like you may have done all the work. You have decided that you're not going to be a person that hits a child. You're not going to be a person that yells too aggressively all the time. Is that the first is your past? Your past is a great obstacle because sometimes you will engage in practices that may be antithetical to your desires. Then there's the child itself. The child or the children may just engage. They may have been influenced by other things that their behavior seems outrageous, and you might think, "I just need to hit them. I just need to hit him. Maybe this
Hmm.
once. I just need to
Yep.
hit him." And so that is work in and of itself. The other work is obstacle could be your own caregiving circle, whether that includes your caregivers who might be telling you to hit the child, to be more punitive, to engage in a set of practices. It could be your friends. It could be the state and the rules that the state has laid out about, because certainly um, parenting is not without its own legal recourse, especially in a hyper surveillance state. So I think people have to be aware of both the emotional obstacles, the social networks that can be, but also the child themselves, and how that those things can all be obstacles to being able to regularly practice positive discipline.
No, that is. I mean, the child will definitely have some big implements into how impacts into how you take it positively or not. So going on to talking about the next segment of our show is sort of practice and habits. And so, what is the positive discipline practice that you do to improve children's development?
So I have a couple of different things. So I run a leadership group, and I also have my own child who has participated over the years in
Mhm,
that group. That's the Grassroots Community Foundations group of Supergirls. Um, I, the children have all kinds of critique, but one of the things is that you have to talk to me. So if you do something that is against the codes, you have to explain it to me, and you have a couple of ways of explaining it to me. I've gotten more creative over the years. You can talk to me. That is always an option. Very few exercise that option. You can video record, um, your reasons why. You can also write a letter as to why.
mhm.
And the video recording and the letter writing, I think a lot of children prefer, because then they don't have to look you dead in the eye
Yeah.
when they tell you why they engage in a thing. And if your actions harm the community, you have to apologize to the community. And
Mhm,
so that has been my predominant response to children who do not do what has been laid out and made clear to them.
Okay. So, what are three good things about this practice?
Well, one is it gives me insight into what children know and don't know. Um, and it helps to remove the idea that they did it out of spite or they did it because they knew. It makes it clear what I need to make clearer and what course of action I need to take to make that clearer. Second, it gives them a voice, which is really important for my work of change making, is that at all point children need to recognize that they have a voice and that voice really matters.
Mhm.
Even if I disagree with their voice, is that their voice should never be silenced. And the third thing that I think it does for me, the practice is that there's always restoration, is that your actions are not singularly about you,
Mhm.
is that when you do something, it is connected to others and that you are in relationship at all time with others. And it is important for me and the work that I do that children think of themselves, but that they recognize themselves as being in context and in relationship with other people.
Mhm. And so, what with the positive, there was always negative. So, what's some of the challenges that sort of occur when you practice?
Oh, many. One is the obstinance of not wanting to explain. Um,
Mhm.
is that it does take a lot of work to get young people to say why. And they are sometimes happy to say, I don't know why. I just did it. And so that is a pain in the butt because it can take a while before they find the words for video, for conversation, or for letters to come up with the why,
Mhm.
and then to revisit the why. Um, then there are children who believe that their own behavior is not connected, that it is, you know, I just did it for myself. Like, I didn't eat my lunch when I was supposed to. It's not that big a deal. Um, and it is that big a deal because you are now hangry. And that's the reason why you got mad and yelled at another child, right? Like it isn't just the harm that you
Mhm.
do to yourself, isn't just decontextualized. So a lot of negative is the pushback from children about what they believe their actions and the consequences are. I think another big action is sometimes the pushback from caregivers who don't practice positive discipline and would rather just punish the child, just would rather be like, well, I told her she needed to listen to you, Dr. Janice, and she didn't listen to you. So I'm going to take away her phone. And I'm like,
Mhm.
that's actually not useful at all,
Mhm.
right? Because she's in a group chat with other girls. They have a project they're working on. Now she's isolated and you have fractured her connection. So, um, you know, several things can come up in the act of trying to take the long way, which is
Yeah.
positive discipline is the long way.
Yeah. So, how do you think this practice impacts your own parenting or your even your perception in life?
I mean, I think that this practice for me is it's been a labor. I was not raised fully with this. I made a decision that I would help my child um, be differently trained and coached and mentored than I was. That I would take the positive parts of the parenting practices that my caregivers employed, and I would bring those forward, and I would drop the beatings. So I got a beating almost every single day during my childhood, and I would say 85% of them lacked rhyme or reason. I would say the 15% that had a cause could have been better handled with a conversation. Um, and if I were not a child who was so obstinate as I am, um, I forced my caregivers into explaining um, why they were hitting me. Like, why
Yep.
are you actually hitting me right now? Um, so, which was really helpful for me because I would just be like, you're choosing to hit me. And and it did help. Having asking immigrant parents why they're hitting you is certainly bold, but it's helpful because sometimes they don't know. Um, so for me, the the disciplinary ways that I've taken is because I make myself learn a new way. I dreamed myself human and
Mhm.
I thought through and practiced the act of talking with. Um, and it is labor intensive, but it's made parenting easier,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So I keep doing it because it keeps making things better than worse.
See, that's always a bonus. Just makes it sets everything up to in order to be easy later on.
Yes. It's a hard
So,
investment though at the beginning. It's a hard
yep,
investment at the beginning.
it definitely sounds like it. It's not gonna be easy at the beginning for sure. So we're gonna sort of skip forward ahead to questions from audience just for to save time and to keep things rolling.
Oh, no
So there's
problem.
just a couple of questions that some audience members have asked us. So, how is positive discipline similar to authoritative parenting style, or is it just completely different?
No, I think that we know that authoritarian parenting style is not
Mhm,
good. It's a punitive style. I would say that positive parenting has several components of authoritative parenting, which is a recognition of who's in charge, and a recognizing that just because you're in charge, when you're in charge, there's a lot of weight to being in charge, right? Which means that you're setting the ground rules for engagement. Where I think positive parenting, I think, is a tool in an authoritative parenting practice. So it's not that it's at odds, is that you need several tools in order to be an authoritative parent, which is you need to recognize that just because you lead doesn't mean that those who you're leading are without voice. And positive parenting creates a space for that. Furthermore, just because you lead doesn't it still requires that children feel like they belong and that they're connected to you and that there's some respect for them. Again, the power differential will not change, but respect is really critical, empathy is really critical, belonging is really critical, um, and those things can exist. So I would say positive parenting is a tool in authoritative parenting practices.
okay. What do you think about discipline practices in the past and now?
So I think that there are a couple of things. What I liked about what Jane Nielsen was talking about is that there is this there's a struggle, especially for those of us who grew up with more punitive practices, parenting practices, that sometimes we swing the pendulum so hard that we end up being really permissive about everything goes,
Mhm.
because we just don't want to be as harsh as our caregivers were to us. And there are a couple of things, and I think that it gets complicated because of the intersectional identities of children now, right? Like, when I was young, there was no space for children to be transgender. There was no space for children to not be in whatever sex group they were deemed in. But now
Mhm.
caregivers have to think about that. Furthermore, the world wasn't so connected. So you have to think about what you're going to do about phones and internet access and all the rest of the. I mean, like, I feel like parenting is way more complicated because caregivers have to know so much more. And young
Mhm.
people are revolutionary. They are learning at the speed of light. And if caregivers are stagnant, we will just be misplaced. So I think that the playground of parenting is really, really different now and is more complicated and requires us to be not only just greater learners, but to be way more empathetic. Like, think some of us who were like, oh, I'm just not going to hit my child, I'm good to go. We are not good to go. We have to, we have so much more to consider in parenting than we ever did.
Mhm.
Because I grew up in a parenting practice where you could be fat phobic, homophobic, even if you didn't hit a child. You could say the most egregious things to children, assuming they would be okay. No, you cannot do that anymore. And you should not want to, but that doesn't mean that you are still not conditioned to want to behave in those ways. So,
Mhm.
you know, I'm really glad that my child is a bit older now. Even though as I try to train these younger kids, I'm like, wow, this is harder.
Yeah.
This is harder.
Okay, perfect. So for the last 10 minutes, I'd love to sort of give you an open mic just to talk about any projects that you've been up to. And it sounds like you're still working on a lot, so I would love to hear more about it.
Okay, so I'm happy to talk about. So I am obsessed with parenting, clearly. And from a sociological standpoint, it is because I am deeply concerned about how ideas are formed and the saliency, the long term impact of early ideas, whether or not those ideas are specifically articulated by the parents or caregivers or by the schools. So in sociology, we talk about early socialization, and we know that moral development starts really early, notions of justice starts really early, and they last, right? Not every single thing lasts, but they last a really long time. So in this book, Parent Like It Matters, I really talk about wanting to lay the foundation for children and for caregivers to recognize joy, and that joy can help children become change making, right? Like, they don't need a profession to make a positive contribution to the world. In book number 2, I'm going to write about boys. And I want to write about the ways in which we um, parent boys, and specifically how we parent boys to think about girls.
Mhm.
So it's not just how we parent boys broadly. Again, I am very, very concerned about the position of women and girls in the world. This includes cis, transgender, right, queer women and girls, but how those people who identify as men and boys, how are they understanding their relationship with people we call women and girls? What do they think of in terms of their roles and responsibilities around platonic love, around romantic love, around familial love? What are the injuries that they have caused, etc.? So I am collecting stories from women and girls, and looks like some men and boys across their life course. So, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, and adulthood, of their relationship with men and boys, in order to understand what injury or care men and boys have caused, and how they're making sense of those relationships. So this has me quite preoccupied because um, this this specific idea to talk to and think about boys' relationship with girls in a non-romantic way and across the life course is both fun and hard. So that's the current project that has a lot of my time and energy. I'm doing some other work around period poverty and the need to provide and structure resources so that every place, everywhere, we treat periods like a natural occurrence, like we do go into the bathroom. So wherever there is toilet paper for free, that there should be menstrual products for free. So I continue that kind of advocacy across the world and recently formed a global menstrual equity council in 5 different countries in order to make that work go forward. So that's kind of what I've been up to.
That sounds like a lot of work. It sounds very, very inspiring there, honestly, especially the menstrual products. I definitely agree. As on my part, I definitely agree with that. It definitely should be free.
Yes.
I'm surprised in the year 2022 it hasn't happened already, but,
I think it's so funny because I think people think that menstruation is an elected process, and I was like,
I
"Have you
wouldn't
met a
elect
menstruator?"
it.
No one would elect it, right? Um, so, and I also recognize that I've recently had some conversations with men where I'm like, how many of you have prayed for a woman to have her period? Where you have prayed that it comes, where you have hoped on the planet Earth, please let her have her period. Many men have prayed for periods to arrive, more so
Mhm.
than women. And it appears that people do not know that all of us humans are here because somebody missed their period.
Mhm.
It's just like it's so there are these small educational gaps about periods that it's like an epiphany. People are like, oh, and I was like, yeah, no period, no humans. They're
Yep,
like, what? Yeah, like if the person does not have the capacity to menstruate, they likely don't have the capacity to give life,
exactly. Yep.
right? Like, so you don't
Exactly.
want it's just so it is. So for me, I think while we remain frustrated, that we know that the biggest obstacle. So why I said these two things in the conversation around boys is that men and boys hold a lot of power but are uninformed about
Mhm.
the way menstruators and women and girls' bodies operate because we, again, socialize men and boys not to think necessarily about women and girls, but their
Yep.
actions becomes policies and laws. And so the injury that sometimes men and boys cause by virtue of their policy making is really important. And so for me,
Mhm.
trying to trace how we get to the places that we've gotten to, how do we get to laws that obstruct choices, workplaces with inequity, etc. Like, how do we get there? I like to start at our beginnings so that we can begin to see life and our ideas, the early ideas, and how they stay salient. So, what is a girl? Should we care? Do they have the same power as I do? Can they do what I do?
Yep.
Um, where do we form that? It's similarly for girls. So we know a lot about how girls think about these issues, but we know very little about how boys think about these matters. So I'm trying to
That's
take
very
that
true.
on.
No,
Um,
and that's a very true point actually. And it's something that we don't talk about that much, that's not being talked about, and I'm glad that there are people out there who are talking about it now in the year 2022, but still any step forward is a step forward anyway. So I think any journey
we'll
that we
take
take is
we'll take whatever we can
exactly.
get.
Exactly. Exactly.
It is very funny to me though that I sometimes say like, given that all boys come from women, how is it that they
Mhm.
have more power?
Yeah,
There's something amiss must have occurred.
yeah.
Um, right? There's
No, yeah,
something.
it's true. It's very
It's
true.
just,
It's like they
and
have the
given,
power, but they don't realize that the power affects their sister, their mother. So
yeah,
it's just there's a huge there's a huge gap between their understanding and what the actual world is.
yeah.
So,
So
yeah.
I want to trace that understanding. That's how I think
Yeah.
about it. I want to trace the understanding because I think that um, a lot of what we sometimes get to is that we assume intentionality from consequences. So
Mhm.
we assume that men and boys are specifically engaged in trying to create systems of harm, and I'm unconvinced that that's exactly true. Um, and as a researcher, it is my job to try to understand and to ask questions that I don't know the answers to. So I don't know how men and boys think about love or injury.
Mhm.
Um, and how they come to think about these ideas and what these ideas mean for how they interact or engage with girls and women. So I'm gonna try to I'm gonna try to get some answers as best I
Yeah.
can.
Yeah, for sure, and definitely I would love I think everyone in the audience would love to see that journey and watch you go on that discovery and yeah.
Thank
So
you.
is there a way that anyone that would like to contact you would be able to?
Yes. Yes. So if you want to know more about my philanthropic work, you can go to grassrootscommunityfoundation.org. That's grassroots with an S, communityfoundation.org. If you want to know more about just like me, the full person, in terms of my work as an educator, as a strategist, and as a philanthropist, you can go to my website, which is the Dr. Janice, JANICE.com. And both of those places, there are two separate emails that you can reach me on. In the more casual way, I'm on LinkedIn, which I sometimes I'm great at. I've just recently written an op ed that seems to be getting a lot of attention on police in there. And the fun place where I hang out, where you can probably get me most of the time, is on Instagram at Dr. Janice Johnson, because it's pictures, and pictures are always just kind of nice.
Yes.
Um, and so you can see my family, my dog. I answer my DMs. My life isn't so crazy that I have to pretend to be a faux celebrity. But if you have intellectual questions, I can answer those. But feel free to email me. Anything that I can answer quickly, I'm happy to answer. But the work is visible in both those spaces.
Okay, well, that's incredible, and it'll be amazing to actually see the journey, and I'll definitely, you'll be seeing a follow from me on Instagram for sure. So,
I would love
y
that.
yeah. Well, I wanna thank you so much, Janice, for coming on and talking about this. It's such an interesting topic, and hearing your perspective as well is greatly regarded as well. So,
Thank
thank you so
you.
much for coming on.
Oh, it is my absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you asking me. And I'm glad you got me to talk about discipline. So now, whenever anyone asks me my thoughts on discipline, I'm going to reference the podcast so that they can get all those answers. They're like, you don't talk about discipline. Oh, but I do. I talked about it with Tina. You should go and listen to the segment on discipline. And then,
Oh.
so you have helped me satisfy a missing piece of my current book, Parent Like It Matters.
Yay, so now that's free advertising for us too, so that's perfect.
It's free.
Alright, I wanna thank everyone for listening today, and definitely go and check out Janice and follow her journey. It sounds like a really interesting one, and it's definitely not over anytime soon, so you'll see her go so, so far with everything that she's going through. Yeah, and thank you everyone for listening and have a good day. Bye.
Bye bye.